So some people say that it's inappropriate to talk about anything political at church, especially in a sermon. What are your thoughts on that?
I find that silly. Churches are social institutions as well as religious institutions. They exist within communities, and the people who sit in pews have lives that they've led prior to coming to church on Wednesday or Sunday or whenever, and they bring into church the struggles that they've experienced. So to think of church as kind of wholly apart from the lives of the people who inhabit them seems to me not only silly but very dangerous, and perhaps an indication of an understanding of ministry that's deeply problematic.
And are there any particular texts or kind of models of religious life or religious preaching that you're drawing upon, kind of in your view on these issues?
Well, so first of all, I come out of, I'm a scholar of African American religion, and particularly thinking about, African American Christendom, and in the context of slavery, there is a sense in which the gospel has this immediate impact. Right? It's not so much about reconciling one's condition as a slave to the conditions of slavery, right? But rather understanding oneself in terms beyond one's condition of being enslaved. So I come out of that tradition, and then there's Jesus reading the scrolls in the temple, right? I mean, that's not a disengaged act. Right? So Luke 4, right? Or you think about Matthew 5, right? So when I think about, myself, if someone asks me, well, what kind of Christian are you? I'm a Matthew 5 Christian, right? I'm more interested in the ministry of the life of Jesus, the ministry of Jesus Christ, than I am in the Christ. And you see what I mean? That's a different sort of thing. But those are some of the things that come to mind.
And as you said, you study and you come out of kind of a Black religious tradition. And I was wondering kind of how you think that the messages that you're sharing also apply to white Christian communities. So to a white Christian pastor, a white Christian priest. I come myself out of a Catholic background.
Same here.
In the Midwest. And so thinking about kind of how do these same lessons translate?
Right. I mean, so at the heart of the gospel is love. And there is an intimate relationship between love and justice. And that isn't beholden to these categories or these specific cultural manifestations, right? So the adjectives matter only in the sense to which, it references the idolatry of one over the other. What do I mean by that? So Black Christianity is an expression of the idolatry of white Christianity. Right? I mean, that's the key, where whiteness overdetermines the noun. Right? So, the theologian Howard Thurman said, the slave dared to redeem the religion profaned in his nest. Right? Because whiteness began to overdetermine the gospel. So if we're concerned about justice, if we're concerned about standing in right relation with our fellows, if love is at the heart of our Christian witness, if we want folk to say, as they say in Acts, they must be drunk, that we're maladjusted to the world as it is, not to be peacocks, right, proclaiming our salvation, that we're saved, but rather, right, evidencing what it means to bear witness to Jesus' love and sacrifice for us. White, green, black, purple, yellow, it doesn't matter.
How do you think race impacts the Christian perspective when voting?
It should, it absolutely does. But, sometimes, most people don't understand when you control for race among Black Christians, we actually bank so far right. We're like next to the Mormons. we're conservative in this sense, usually around quote unquote values questions. But race continues to overdetermine every aspect of American life. One of the most segregated hours in the United States is the church hour. That has political resonance, it has cultural resonance, it has historical resonances. So race continues to operate But we see conservative churches in black communities as we see conservative churches in white communities, right? No one has any monopoly on the prophetic voice. No one has any monopoly on the prophetic voice. But what I do know is that we're in a moment where the country has an opportunity to be otherwise, and it has doubled down on its historic ugliness. Right? And if there are voices coming out of religious traditions, and particularly the Christian tradition, they should be calling us out of this wilderness into a new way of being in the world.
So I also wanted to ask, do you think congregations, church communities should take a stand on political issues? And I guess I ask that also because, I've heard in my own life the kind of hesitancy of religious leaders to say, we can't take a stand on political issues because we don't want to divide the community. We want to acknowledge that people disagree. But on kind of these, these really important topics that I think you and I both agree there's an answer. There is kind of a side taken kind of in the biblical text. Kind of how should faith communities respond in ways that both acknowledge kind of the need for the unity of that community, but also acknowledge the prophetic role that church communities play.
And there's a debate in the biblical text, right? So it's not as if it's just settled, right? So one could find resources for a position that is anti-LGBTQ, and one can find resources in the same text that suggest a wholly different view. I mean, we can argue on Christian grounds about what we mean when we say we're Christian. So I think the idea of churches trying to stand in neutral space for fear of conflict and struggle makes you complicit in the world as it is. Yeah. If I'm going to, I was born and raised Catholic on the coast of Mississippi, and if I'm going to evidence that, Josephite tradition in the way in which I inhabit the world, I'm going to do it in such a way that's probably in alignment with Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker, right? And I don't want to say that you can't do that, right? Just like I don't want to say that, Martin King couldn't give voice to the kind of prophetic Baptist tradition out of which he came, that social gospel tradition. But if we make that argument, we have to understand that folks are going to come invoke their commitments in a way that can serve conservative ends. So you can't decry Pat Robertson using religious language to justify his political positions and then uplift Martin King for his, right? No, when religion enters into the public domain, right, it is an incredibly vexing issue, and you're not going to rid us of the tensions by banishing it into the closets, because then you create the conditions for people engaging in bad faith.
And so how, in our community lives do we, respond to that vexation? Do we sit in that tension, the tension that exists, from these multiple views that come from and use a religious language and a religious vacuum?
Yeah, we sit in it. We fight it out. We struggle. Yeah. We battle. Right? I mean, the history of Christianity involves that struggle, and there are winners and losers, right? I mean, we can tell. You were a religion major at Princeton. You know that incredibly complex history, right? And so, we create but we have to do it in a loving way, right? We can't be bombing abortion buildings. That just seems to be contradictory, right? You want to value life and then you take life at the same time. It doesn't make any sense to me. But I think, we have to argue. Those who are self-identified Christians have to argue on Christian grounds that this is not what the gospel is.
Yeah. It sounds to me like what you're talking about is something about the relationship between the pastoral and the political. And I was wondering how you feel like that manifests itself, especially kind of in the moment of the sermon, at the pulpit, the preacher at the pulpit, and kind of what are at stakes in that moment?
Right. In African American religious studies, we make this distinction between the priestly function and the prophetic function, right? And oftentimes, African American religious institutions are reduced to its prophetic function. We read them solely as social institutions, only concerned with the political reality of black life in the country. And that's not right. And then the priestly function, of course, has everything to do with tending to the souls of folks, right? Kind of relating the gospel as it is understood to the spiritual lives of folks, right? Getting them to understand that vertical relation, not just simply that horizontal relation. So those aren't in opposition, although they often are thought of as in opposition, as if the prophetic function or the political function can be thought of apart from the pastoral, because our relationships to each other, right, seem to me at least to be bound up with our relationship to God. If we stand in right relation to the source of love, then we evidence that love in our relationship with others. And so the pastoral function is really key. It just can't be apart from the actual lives we live, the worlds that we inhabit.
What lessons do you think that we can learn from the 2016 election to better equip communities of faith in 2020?
It's a very hard question, very complicated question. What we've learned is that there are pockets of American Christendom tied to televangelists, bound up with certain kind of prosperity gospel, tethered to a certain understanding of the faith that has reconciled itself with the ugliness of power. And to my mind, going back to Acts, that's you two adjusted. Something's wrong. Right? Something's wrong. Calls to mind the anger of Jesus in the temple. Right? So too many people have reconciled the relationship between their faith and power. So what is the lesson for me? The lesson for me coming out of 2016 is that we have to be boldly prophetic in this moment. We have to put forward. I just finished a book on James Baldwin, and Jimmy would say, we have to work day in and day out for a new Jerusalem, right? And a new Jerusalem involves a different way of being in the world, right? And we have too many Christians who have doubled down on whiteness, doubled down on greed, doubled down on their access to power. They're idolaters, some of them, hypocrites, some of them. It's a harsh judgment, but I think it's one that needs to be made.
And so as a young person, as a young Catholic, as a young person who studies religion, why do we stay in religious traditions? Why do we stay in the church? If we can see this long history, and not specifically the Catholic Church, but any religious tradition, why stay? Why have this debate on these grounds, and kind of what tools does it offer a secular world, or what tools does it offer kind of the individual person trying to navigate their way through a fraught political world, fraught social world?
That's a great question, It's a question that presupposes the secular is somehow apart from the religious as opposed to being a religious construction. We're much more than our political lives, even though our political lives are so critical to who we are, shaping the distribution of advantage and disadvantage, burden and benefit. But we're not reducible to those political realities. We're having to deal with mysteries of life. We're having to deal with the darkness of disappointment and evil, small e, and how they shape our world. We're having to deal with the reality of death and suffering. We're having to deal with a longing to be more than what we happen to think, that the world is more than what it is. Politics doesn't exhaust those questions. So what does it mean to commit oneself to the spiritual disciplines, right? To think about the importance of prayer, meditation, to kind of think of oneself, right, as in some ways involved in a spiritual journey, to understand the gift of life, right, the miracle that it is, right, and the inevitability of death, and what that means, right? So I say all that to say that religion, whether it's Christianity or the religions of the books, what religion, this incredibly, terribly complicated category, what it does for us is, right, it orients us to the complexity of what it means to be a human being in time and space. Politics is just one blip in that. It's not all of that. So the world is what it is. We inhabit it. religion is not reducible to all of its vagaries and whatnot. It helps us understand and make sense of the world.
And so thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
joining us.
Appreciate
I really
you.
appreciated this conversation.
I hope so.